6-year-old Isla Marsh had been profoundly deaf since birth, communicating entirely through American Sign Language. And on the day she stood on the Family Feud stage beside her mother, an interpreter positioned just off camera to bridge the gap between Isla's world and the studio's, she raised her small hands during a quiet moment between rounds and signed 4 words directly at Steve Harvey, without waiting for the interpreter to translate first. Steve, who had picked up a little basic sign language over the years from a cousin who was hard of hearing, recognized 2 of the 4 signs immediately, enough to understand the shape of what she'd said before the interpreter's voice even caught up. The entire audience, watching Isla's hands move with total conviction, went completely silent, sensing something significant had happened before most of them understood what. The morning had begun like any other taping day at the Atlanta studio. Steve arrived just before 9, running through his usual pre-show energy, cracking jokes with the crew about a delayed shipment of new podium microphones. Backstage, Isla sat with her mother, Priya Marsh, and their assigned ASL interpreter, a calm, experienced woman named Denise, who'd worked with the family for 2 years. Ila's father, Raj, had passed away 18 months earlier from a sudden cardiac event, leaving Priya to raise Ila largely alone, while also managing the ongoing costs of her specialized education and communication support. Isla sat quietly, watching the studio activity around her with the intense visual focus deaf children often develop, since her entire experience of the world depended on watching rather than listening for cues. Steve, doing his usual rounds of greeting families, crouched down and signed a simple, slightly clumsy hello to Isla, delighting her enough to earn a bright, surprised smile. But nobody in that studio knew what was coming. Priya had been navigating single motherhood and Isla's specific needs since Raj's death, juggling a full-time job as a medical billing coordinator with the demands of ensuring Isla received consistent access to interpreters, specialized educational support, and the assistive technology that made her daily life navigable. Raj's life insurance policy had been smaller than they'd planned for, most of it consumed within the first year by funeral costs, and a brief period where Priya had to reduce her hours to manage the transition, leaving little cushion for the ongoing expenses Isla's education required. Raj had been the one who'd learned sign language most fluently between the 2 of them, taking a 2-year course before Isla was even born once early hearing screenings suggested she might be deaf. And Priya had spent the 18 months since his death catching up on her own fluency, largely through necessity, practicing late at night with instructional videos long after Isla had gone to sleep. Isla attended a mainstream elementary school with support from a school-provided interpreter for a portion of the day, but the district's budget only covered 4 hours of interpreter services daily, leaving 2 hours where Isla sat in class without full access to what was being taught, relying instead on lip reading she'd never fully mastered and written materials that arrived, when they arrived at all, well after the rest of the class had moved on. Priya had requested additional interpreter hours through a formal accommodation review, denied, citing budget constraints specific to that fiscal year. She appealed with a letter from Isla's audiologist, documenting the specific educational gap the reduced hours created. Denied again, the district citing that reasonable accommodation had already been met under the 4-hour threshold, regardless of documented gaps in comprehension. A third request, filed through a disability rights advocate Priya found through a support group, was still under review with no resolution timeline as of the taping. The 2 uncovered hours typically fell during science and social studies, subjects Isla's teacher reported she consistently scored lower in compared to reading and math, a pattern the school attributed informally to subject difficulty, rather than the more obvious explanation that Isla simply wasn't receiving full access to instruction during exactly those blocks. Priya had sat through 4 separate meetings with school administrators over the course of a single school year, each one ending with sympathetic language and no actual policy change. The district's special education coordinator repeatedly explaining that budget allocations were set annually and couldn't be adjusted mid-year regardless of documented need. Priya had begun recording these meetings at her advocate's suggestion, specifically to build a paper trail for the ongoing appeal, a level of documentation she found exhausting to maintain on top of everything else she was managing alone. What almost nobody at Priya's workplace understood was how much she was managing quietly on her own. She told her supervisor she was handling things fine when asked how she was adjusting after Raj's death. She told her sister on the phone that Isla was doing great, really thriving, which was true in the ways that mattered most to Priya, but glossed over the daily friction of navigating a system that treated Isla's full access to education as negotiable rather than essential. She told Isla, every night through sign language across the small kitchen table where they ate dinner together, that everything was going to be okay. A promise she made with total sincerity, even as she lay awake many nights calculating exactly how much longer their savings could stretch to cover a private interpreter for the 2 uncovered hours, an expense she'd started paying out of pocket 3 days a week at $40 an hour, money that came directly out of what she'd hoped to set aside for Isla's future. Priya had also quietly given up her own graduate certification coursework, something she'd been pursuing evenings before Raj died, in order to free up both the money and the mental bandwidth the private interpreter arrangement required. She never mentioned this sacrifice to anyone, not even her sister, partly because she didn't want it framed as a burden when she still considered it, without question, the right choice for Ela. Her own physical health had quietly slipped in the process too. She'd missed her last 2 annual physicals, always meaning to reschedule, never quite finding a window that didn't compete directly with an interpreter appointment, a school meeting, or a shift at work she couldn't afford to lose. Isla, for her part, had developed a particular resilience that Priya found both remarkable and quietly heartbreaking to witness. She'd learned to identify, through visual cues alone, which of her classmates were kind and patient enough to slow down and face her directly when speaking, gravitating toward those friendships while accepting, without complaint, the moments each day when the classroom's spoken conversation simply moved past her, information lost to a gap nobody outside her specific situation seemed to fully register as urgent. One evening, about 3 months before the taping, Isla had signed to her mother, unprompted, at the dinner table, "Why doesn't school hear me the way you do?" Priya had to excuse herself to the kitchen sink for a moment before she could compose an answer honest enough to satisfy her daughter's question without overwhelming her with the full weight of the bureaucratic answer behind it. The specific reason Priya applied for Family Feud was almost coincidental. A coworker's cousin had appeared on the show the previous year and mentioned how the experience, beyond the prize money, had connected her with resources she hadn't known existed. Priya filled out the application mentioning Isla's deafness and their interpreter needs in the accommodations section, receiving confirmation within days that a certified interpreter would be provided for the taping at no cost. A detail that alone felt like more support than she'd received from Isla's own school district in over a year. The taping moved through its rounds with typical energy, families trading points, Steve riffing with the crowd between rounds. Isla, watching Denise interpret each exchange in real time, participated actively, delighting the audience with her expressive animated signing style during her turns at the podium. During a lull while the board reset, Steve, curious and clearly charmed by her, crouched down and, through Denise's interpretation, asked Ela what her favorite thing about the day had been so far. Ela didn't wait for the full translation to complete before responding. She raised her hands and signed directly at Steve. 4 distinct, deliberate signs. Her expression serious in a way that shifted the entire mood of the interaction before a single word of translation reached the audience. The studio fell completely silent. Steve, watching her hands move, recognized the sign for you immediately, and then, a beat later, recognized enough of the following signs to understand the shape of the sentence before Denise's voice caught up. His smile faded, replaced by something more focused, more still. When Denise's translation finally reached the microphone, her voice slightly unsteady, she said, she signed, "You see me. Nobody sees me." 300 people stopped breathing at the same moment. Priya, standing at the family podium, brought both hands to her mouth, clearly having understood the signs in real time, her shoulders beginning to shake before Denise's translation even finished. Steve stayed crouched at Isla's eye level, saying nothing for several long seconds, the silence stretching long enough that even crew members in the wings, sensing the shift, stopped their usual quiet movement between segments entirely. Steve took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at Priya, then back at Isla, and signed slowly and deliberately the small vocabulary he had, "I see you." Ila's face broke into something between relief and disbelief, and she signed back rapidly, too fast for Steve to follow without Denise's help. And Denise translated, "Nobody at school waits for me like this. You waited." But Steve wasn't done. He stood up and turned to his stage manager. "Stop everything," he said. "This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show, and I'm not moving past it." A producer near the wings gestured for a commercial break, and Steve waved him off entirely. "No network approval," he said. "This is me, Steve Harvey, and we're stopping right now." He turned back to Priya. "Tell me about the interpreter hours. All of it." Priya explained the 4-hour daily coverage, the 2 uncovered hours, the denied accommodation requests, the $40 an hour private interpreter she'd been paying out of pocket 3 days a week just to close part of the gap. Steve's jaw tightened as he listened. "Let me tell you something," he said, turning to address both Priya and the cameras at once. "I grew up watching people get overlooked because helping them required a little more effort than the system wanted to give. And I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had a platform big enough to make somebody stop overlooking a child, I'd use it without hesitation. Because 30 years ago, watching people I loved get treated like their needs were optional, I learned that silence about it only lets that treatment continue." He wasn't finished. Steve pulled out his phone right there on the stage, something no host does mid-taping, and called a contact at a national organization providing communication access support for deaf and hard-of-hearing students. "I need full-day interpreter coverage funded for a 6-year-old named Isla Marsh starting immediately, and I want her school district contacted today about updating their accommodation plan to reflect actual need, not a budget minimum," he said into the phone, loud enough for the front rows to hear every word. He hung up before waiting for a response, certain of the answer. He turned to face the cameras directly. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home," he said. "A 6-year-old just told me, without a single spoken word, that most of her day happens without anyone waiting long enough to actually see her. That's not a deaf child's problem to solve. That's on the rest of us to fix." Priya was crying openly now, and dozens in the audience were too, several of them visibly moved by watching Isla's hands rather than needing Denise's translation at all by that point. And then he did something no one expected, even his own producers. He announced that both competing families would split the full fast money prize regardless of outcome. The Delgado family, competing that day, crossed the stage without hesitation, their youngest son signing a clumsy but sincere thank you he'd apparently learned that morning, just from watching Isla. a small gesture that visibly moved her more than almost anything else that happened. 3 months after the taping, Isla's school district reversed its accommodation decision, funding full-day interpreter coverage for the remainder of the school year and committing to a permanent policy review district-wide. Isla's teacher reported that her science and social studies scores rose noticeably within the first full grading period of consistent coverage. A shift Priya said confirmed everything she'd been arguing in 4 unsuccessful meetings over the previous year. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, it crossed 245 million views across platforms within the first 2 weeks. And the hashtag #YouSeeMe trended for 8 consecutive days, prompting several other families of deaf children to share similar stories of inadequate interpreter coverage in their own districts, with at least a dozen school districts nationwide reporting formal accommodation reviews, initiated directly in response to renewed parent advocacy following the clip's circulation. A year after the taping, Priya had joined a statewide advocacy coalition pushing for updated accommodation standards for deaf students. Work, she said, gave her a sense of purpose beyond simply managing Isla's needs day to day. And it also resumed her graduate certification coursework, finally freed from the financial strain of the private interpreter costs. Today, the YouSeeMe Foundation, named directly from Isla's own words that day, has funded interpreter services for over 970 deaf and hard-of-hearing students nationwide whose districts fell short of adequate coverage, and to date has distributed $13 million toward that mission, alongside a parent advocacy training program teaching families how to build the kind of documentation trail Priya had assembled largely on her own. Isla still practices new signs with Steve over occasional video calls, something Priya said neither of them expected to become a genuine, ongoing relationship. In a later interview, Steve said learning even a small amount of sign language years earlier from his cousin turned out to be one of the most important things he'd ever accidentally prepared for. "I didn't know that day would come," he said. "But I'm grateful every day that I understood her before the interpreter's voice even caught up. Because in that gap, in those 2 seconds, is exactly the kind of waiting she'd been asking for her whole life." He added that he'd started taking more formal ASL lessons himself since the taping, wanting to be able to hold a fuller conversation the next time he saw Isla, rather than relying on the handful of signs he'd picked up secondhand years earlier. Priya still sends updates to Steve's team every few months, and Isla recently signed, unprompted, during a video call, that she wanted to be an interpreter herself one day, so other kids like her would never have to feel unseen. What Isla's 4 signed words revealed to a stunned studio, and to millions watching afterward, wasn't really about deafness in isolation. It was a reminder that being truly seen often requires nothing more than someone willing to slow down long enough to actually look, and that the smallest act of patience can be the difference between a child who feels invisible and one who finally, unmistakably, does not. Priya said it plainly in a later conversation. Her daughter hadn't needed anyone to fix her deafness. She'd only ever needed someone willing to wait the 2 extra seconds it took to actually understand her. If this story about a deaf girl's 4 words moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that being seen is one of the most basic forms of love there is. Have you ever felt truly seen by someone who simply took the time to wait for you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more moments that restore your faith in humanity.